The judge has decided. Tell me. You knew. Knew exactly what?
You should have had someone fighting for you like this.
They cast him into the freezing wilderness with nothing, expecting the brutal winter to erase him completely. Jax Harlan had already lost everything a man could lose by the time that wooden door clicked shut behind him. No family, no sanctuary, just the howling winds of the mountain and the fading echoes of a life he no longer recognized. But Smoky refused to let him surrender. The fiercely loyal German shepherd dragged him forward through the blinding white, toward a forgotten stone sanctuary buried deep beneath the earth, where something silent and monumental was waiting to be found. Before we continue this journey together, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. The night they told Jax Harlan he was no longer welcome, the house did not shatter with screaming or the violent crash of broken glass. There was no theatrical display of anger echoing through the ancient, settling timber of the farmhouse that had anchored their family to the valley floor for 3 generations. There was only a suffocating, sterile quiet, the rhythmic metallic drip of the kitchen faucet, the low, vibrating hum of an aging refrigerator fighting against the cold, the heavy scraping of a wooden chair against the faded, scratched linoleum. Jack stood anchored in the doorway, the heavy snow from the evening pasture still clinging stubbornly to the worn leather of his boots, his breath forming faint, ghostly clouds in the dim yellowed light of the overhead bulb. He had just finished mending the southern fence line, a punishing, freezing chore he had performed every winter since his hands were large enough to hold a pair of heavy iron pliers. Nothing about the biting wind outside or the familiar deep ache in his frozen knuckles had offered him the slightest warning that this night would be his final one beneath the roof he had bled for. Across the scarred oak dining table, his older brother Elias refused to lift his gaze. Elias kept his eyes rigidly fixed upon a sharply creased stack of legal documents, papers Jax had never been invited to read or understand. Beside him, Sarah sat with the stiff, unyielding posture of a judge presiding over a condemned man, her manicured hands wrapped tightly around a porcelain mug of coffee that had turned bitter and cold hours ago. She was the one who broke the silence, her voice devoid of any human warmth or hesitation. "You have overstayed your welcome, Jax." The words were not loud, because they did not need to be. They carried the heavy, unmistakable weight of a final verdict. Jax furrowed his brow, the frost on his eyelashes melting as his exhausted mind struggled to process the sheer coldness of her statement. "What are you talking about?" Sarah finally lifted her chin and met his eyes. There was absolutely no trace of anger in her expression, and more terrifyingly, there was not a single shred of guilt. It was the tired, impatient look of someone closing a book they had never enjoyed reading in the first place. "This is not your home anymore," she stated evenly. The sheer gravity of the words did not strike him all at once. They drifted down into his consciousness with the agonizing slowness of winter snow falling through dead, still air. Jax released a slow, trembling breath, his mind scrambling to find logic in the sudden madness. "Dad just passed away a month ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, sounding hollow even to his own ears. Elias shifted his weight in the heavy oak chair, yet his cowardly eyes remained glued to the paperwork, tracing the lines of ink as if they held the secrets of the universe. "And the estate has been finalized," Elias recited, his tone sounding sickeningly rehearsed, a script practiced in the dark mirrors of their bedroom. Jax shifted his gaze from the stark white paper in his brother's trembling hands back to the familiar but suddenly alien face of his own blood. "So what exactly does that mean for me?" This time Elias spoke, his voice carrying a flat, metallic finality that left no room for interpretation. "It means the deed is entirely in my name now." He paused, letting the silence stretch out like a tight wire across a canyon, "and it means we are no longer legally or morally responsible for carrying your dead weight." A strange, suffocating pressure coiled tightly within Jax's chest. It was not a sharp, explosive burst of rage, but rather a slow, crushing weight, like a massive stone settling heavily over his scarred lungs. "I have lived on this land for my entire life," Jax said, the quiet desperation in his voice betraying the hardened, unbreakable exterior he usually wore as armor against the world. Sarah stood up with deliberate slowness, placing her porcelain mug onto the table with a sharp, resonant click that seemed to echo endlessly off the peeling wallpaper. "You returned here," she corrected him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she delivered the final blow. That is a very different thing. Returned, the word hung in the air, a poisonous, rotting accusation, as if the agonizing years he had spent deployed in the darkest corners of the earth, years he had certainly not chosen for a vacation, years filled with horrors he could never bring himself to speak of, had simply erased his right to exist in the place he was born. As if his sacrifice, the pieces of his soul he had left buried in foreign sand, was merely an inconvenient absence to them. Jax opened his mouth to defend himself, to scream, to demand an explanation for this cruelty, but the words withered and died dry in his throat. Before he could force a single sound past his lips, a low, powerful rumble vibrated through the floorboards behind him. Smoky stepped forward. The massive, magnificent German shepherd had been resting near the entryway, listening and watching with that terrifyingly still, hyper-aware focus that only dogs possess when they sense a malignant shift in the atmosphere. Now, the dog moved with deliberate, lethal purpose, inserting his broad, muscular body directly between Jax and the table. Smoky stood rigid, his ears pinned forward, a deep, menacing growl vibrating continuously deep within his chest. It was not an uncontrolled display of wild aggression. It was a calculated, absolute promise of violence if anyone in that room took a step closer to his master. Sarah recoiled instantly, her posture stiffening in genuine, wide-eyed alarm. "Control your animal," she snapped, her voice trembling slightly as she took a half-step backward. Jax did not flinch. He slowly lowered his calloused, freezing hand, resting it gently upon the thick, coarse fur of Smoky's back, feeling the incredible coiled heat and tension vibrating just beneath his palm. "He is not doing anything," Jax replied softly, the connection grounding him to reality. "He is making me feel extremely unsafe," she countered, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. Smoky did not blink. His dark, intelligent eyes locked with unyielding intensity onto Elias. Elias finally slammed the paperwork down flat on the table and looked up, a flash of genuine irritation twisting his features, masking his underlying fear. "Jax, this is not a negotiation or a discussion." The words struck with the blunt force of a physical blow to the sternum. Not a discussion, not a family meeting, not a disagreement between brothers trying to find a path forward. It was an execution order that had already been signed in his absence. Jax felt a sudden, dangerous spark ignite somewhere deep behind his ribs. It was a phantom flicker of the terrifying, consuming rage he used to carry with him in the war zones, an anger he had spent years trying to bury beneath the quiet, methodical routine of farm work. "What exactly are you commanding me to do?" Jax asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously calm, the calm before the artillery strikes. Elias carefully aligned the edges of the documents, treating the paper with far more respect than he treated his own brother. "I am telling you that you need to pack your things and leave this property tonight." The ancient grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with mocking, relentless precision. Tick, tick, tick. Jax stared at the man he had grown up with, the boy he had protected in the schoolyard, desperately waiting for a flicker of hesitation, a sign of profound regret, anything that might soften the jagged, bleeding edges of this unimaginable betrayal. There was nothing. There was only empty, cowardly resolve. Sarah crossed her arms tight against her chest, fortifying her position. "We have been more than generous with our patients. You have no formal employment. You do not contribute to the mortgage. We are not operating a charity for broken soldiers." Jax felt a hollow, broken laugh rise in his dry throat, but he swallowed it down like crushed glass. Not a charity. He remembered being 8 years old, sitting at this exact table, eating watered-down, tasteless soup so Elias could have the larger portion of meat because he had a football game. He remembered being 16, out in the blinding blizzards repairing the heavy steel tractor, while Elias stayed warm inside applying for out-of-state colleges. He remembered being 19, signing his life away to the military because there simply was not enough money for both of them to stay on the ranch. And now at 38, standing here with the frost still melting on his heavy jacket, he was being discarded like a rusted, useless tool that no longer served a purpose. His hand tightened instinctively in Smoky's thick coat. "I have bled for this ranch since before I could walk," Jax stated, his voice carrying the immovable weight of absolute truth. "And we thank you for your past efforts," Sarah replied smoothly, her tone dripping with rehearsed, corporate condescension that made his stomach turn. "But gratitude does not mean you are entitled to stay here forever." "Forever," Jax slowly turned his head, taking in the chipped white paint on the kitchen cabinets, the dented metal of the old gas stove, the frosted window that framed the sprawling pastures currently buried beneath 3 feet of merciless snow. He had poured his soul into every square inch of this property, burying his youth in its soil. And in the span of 5 devastating minutes, none of it belonged to him anymore. Smoky's growl deepened, the vibration traveling up Jax's arm, warning him that the tension in the room was reaching a breaking point. Jax exhaled a long, shuddering breath and squeezed the dog's neck firmly, sending a silent command down through his fingertips. "Stand down." Smoky instantly ceased the audible growl, but he did not retreat a single inch, his body remaining an impenetrable shield between Jax and the world. Elias pushed his heavy chair back with a loud, abrasive scrape and stood to his full height, attempting to reclaim authority in the room. "I will give you until tomorrow morning to clear your things out." Jax slowly shook his head, his eyes dead, cold, and entirely unreadable. "No." Both Elias and Sarah blinked in simultaneous surprise, thrown off balance by the immediate rejection of their generous timeline. "I will leave right now." Jax was mildly surprised by the eerie, detached calmness of his own voice. It was the voice of a man stepping onto a battlefield, accepting that he might not return. Elias frowned, a flicker of deep unease passing through his eyes as he realized the magnitude of what he had just done. "Suit yourself." Jax turned his back on them without offering another syllable, his heavy boots thudding softly as he walked down the narrow, dimly lit hallway toward his bedroom. The room looked exactly as it had for years, sparse, utilitarian, completely stripped of comfort. A narrow, creaking bed, a battered wooden dresser, and a faded olive-drab military duffel bag that had never truly been unpacked, as if his subconscious always knew he would never be allowed to settle in this place. He moved with the frightening mechanical efficiency of a soldier breaking down camp under enemy fire. He grabbed a few heavy flannel shirts, thick wool socks, the heavy insulated tactical jacket he had worn during his final deployment in the mountains of the Middle East, and a single faded photograph of his father, taken long before the sickness had hollowed out his strong frame. That was the entirety of his existence. 38 years of life, compressed into one battered canvas bag. Smoky shadowed his every movement, pacing the small confines of the room, his tail tucked low, his entire posture radiating a tense, fiercely protective distress. When Jax finally dragged the heavy metal zipper closed, the harsh, rasping sound seemed impossibly loud in the dead, suffocating quiet of the house. He slung the heavy nylon strap over his broad shoulder and stood in the doorway, committing the room to memory one last time, locking it away in the vault of things he would never see again. There was nothing remaining here for him, nothing that had not already been stolen. As he walked back through the kitchen, Elias and Sarah remained frozen in their previous positions, cowards unwilling to witness the execution they had ordered. Neither of them offered a single word of farewell. Neither of them possessed the basic human courage to look him in the eye as he carried his life out the door. When Jax reached the heavy front door, he paused with his gloved hand resting on the brass knob. He did not stop because he expected a sudden apology, but because some small, stubbornly hopeful, broken piece of his heart needed absolute, final confirmation that they truly did not care if he lived or died. The silence from the kitchen was deafening, a roaring testament to their betrayal. He twisted the cold knob and pulled the heavy door open. The brutal Montana winter assaulted him instantly. It was a physical wall of agonizing cold, sharp and completely unforgiving, stealing the breath from his lungs before he could even exhale. The night stretched out before him in a terrifying, endless canvas of pitch-black darkness and blinding white snow. The heavy crust of ice crunched violently beneath his heavy boots as he stepped down off the wooden porch. Smoky flanked him instantly, his thick double coat rendering him entirely unfazed by the plunging, sub-zero temperatures. Behind them, the heavy door clicked shut. It was not slammed in anger, it was merely closed, shutting him out of the world of the living with quiet, brutal finality. Jax stood at the edge of the long driveway for a long, terrible moment, the immense, crushing silence of the mountain valley pressing inward against his skull like a physical vice. The wind began to gather tremendous speed, sweeping down from the high, jagged peaks, carrying that hollow, moaning frequency that always preceded a catastrophic, blinding storm. As the wind whipped violently around his freezing ears, the sound began to warp. The frequency shifted, bending reality. The howling gale transformed in his mind, shifting from wind into the deafening, rhythmic, concussive thud of military transport rotors cutting through heavy air. The pristine white snow blurring across his vision suddenly morphed into a choking storm of gray concrete dust and falling, burning ash. His chest seized violently, his lungs completely refusing to expand. He was no longer standing in Montana. He was trapped deep underground in a subterranean bunker, the reinforced concrete walls violently shaking, the ceiling raining debris as the earth collapsed around him, burying his squad alive in the absolute dark. The terror was pure, unadulterated, and paralyzing. A massive solid weight slammed heavily against his thigh. Smoky. The dog did not just gently nudge him. He threw his entire 70-pound muscular body against Jax's leg, a forceful, undeniable living anchor pulling him violently back to the present moment. Jax gasped, a sharp, tearing intake of freezing air, his eyes snapping wide open as the terrifying hallucination shattered into a million pieces. The gray dust vanished, replaced by falling snow. The concussive rotors faded back into the screaming mountain wind. He dropped heavily, to one knee into a snowdrift, burying his trembling, freezing hands deep into the thick, warm fur on either side of Smoky's magnificent face. "I'm here," Jax choked out, his breath ragged and desperate, the cold searing his throat. "I'm right here." Smoky stared directly into his fractured soul, his dark brown eyes carrying an ancient, unbreakable strength, an unspoken vow that he would never abandon him. The dog leaned forward, pressing his warm nose firmly against Jax's icy cheek, a silent promise that they would face the suffocating dark together. Jax slowly pushed himself back to his feet, his muscles protesting the cold, adjusting the heavy strap of the duffel bag across his chest. The paved road leading back toward the town, toward warm artificial lights, toward people, and the fleeting comfort of civilization, lay to his left. Jax turned entirely away from it. He turned his scarred face directly into the howling wind, marching straight into the dense, black, foreboding tree line of the unforgiving mountain wilderness. He was walking willingly into a place where the cold froze the blood in your veins, where the deep shadows swallowed men whole, and where nobody in the world would ever come searching for him. But as he marched step by agonizing step into the abyss, with the magnificent, fearless German shepherd leading the way through the rapidly deepening drifts, Jax Harlan realized he was not walking toward death. He was finally truly walking away from it. The brutal march into the heart of the Bitterroot wilderness was not a test of physical endurance. It was a slow, agonizing descent into a frozen purgatory that sought to strip away the very essence of human resilience. The snow fell with a blinding, terrifying density, transforming the towering, ancient pines into distorted, ghostly monoliths that offered absolutely no shelter from the relentless, slicing wind. Jax Harlan pushed his failing body forward, his heavy, ice-caked boots sinking knee-deep into the pristine, treacherous powder with every agonizing step. The temperature had plummeted drastically in the hours since he had walked away from the farmhouse, dropping well below zero, weaponizing the air itself so that every desperately drawn breath felt like swallowing shattered glass. He had completely lost his sense of direction, his internal compass scrambled by the swirling, disorienting whiteout that erased the horizon and blended the earth seamlessly into the dark, churning sky. Time ceased to exist as a linear concept, measured only by the rhythmic, exhausting drag of his own frozen limbs and the burning ache radiating through his chest. Beside him, cutting a deliberate, unbroken path through the heavy drifts, Smoky moved with the relentless, unyielding determination of a wolf returning to its ancestral hunting grounds. The massive German shepherd periodically paused, allowing the heavy snow to build upon his thick, dark coat, turning his head to ensure his master was still following. Smoky's dark eyes were the only anchor Jax had left in a world that had entirely lost its shape and meaning. But the human body, regardless of how thoroughly it has been conditioned by the rigors of warfare and extreme survival, possesses finite limits, and Jax was rapidly approaching the absolute edge of his. The insidious, deceptive nature of severe hypothermia began to creep into Jax's bloodstream, a silent, deadly thief, stealing his agonizing pain and replacing it with a terrifying, heavy numbness. The biting, agonizing burn in his frozen fingers and toes slowly faded away, leaving behind a heavy, clumsy deadness that traveled steadily upward toward his vital organs. His vision began to narrow, the edges of the world blurring into a dark, pulsing vignette. A profound, overwhelming exhaustion washed over him, whispering sweet, treacherous lies into his fading consciousness. The freezing snow beneath his boots suddenly stopped feeling like a frozen tomb and began to look like an incredibly soft, inviting bed. Just a few minutes, his exhausted mind lied to him, the thought echoing through his skull with a dangerous, soothing melody. Just close your eyes for 5 minutes to gather your strength, and then you can keep walking. Jax stumbled, his heavy boot catching on a hidden, submerged root, and he crashed heavily to his knees, his hands plunging deep into the freezing snow. He did not immediately push himself back up. The wind howled around him, but it sounded strangely distant now, muted and muffled like the ocean heard through the thick glass of a deep-sea submersible. He slowly allowed his heavy shoulders to sag, his chin dropping toward his chest as he gave in to the incredible, narcotic pull of the freezing dark. A sharp, violent yelp shattered the dangerous silence inside his head. Smoky was there instantly, his massive head thrusting forcefully under Jax's heavy arm, aggressively throwing his weight upward to prevent the man from collapsing entirely into the drift. Jax let out a weak, irritated groan, attempting to wave the dog away with a clumsy, frozen hand, but Smoky was relentless. The dog grabbed the thick, heavy fabric of Jax's tactical jacket in his powerful jaws and pulled backward with all of his formidable strength, a desperate, frantic maneuver that nearly dragged Jax back to his feet. Smoky released the fabric and let out a deep, sharp, demanding bark, a sound that cut through the howling wind and directly pierced the fog of Jax's dying mind. I know, Jax slurred, his words thick and clumsy, his jaw trembling violently as the freezing air hit his tongue. I'm getting up. He forced his protesting, frozen muscles to fire, pushing himself upright with agonizing slowness, leaning heavily against the rough freezing bark of a towering pine tree to keep from collapsing again. Smoky did not return to the trail they had been carving. Instead, the dog suddenly snapped his head toward the sheer, rocky incline of the mountain to their right. His ears pinned forward, his nose twitching rapidly as he caught a scent, or perhaps an ancient instinct that completely diverted his attention from their desperate march. Without waiting for a command, Smoky abandoned the path and began to scramble up the steep, treacherous, snow-covered embankment, his powerful claws digging furiously into the hidden ice. Jax blinked, his exhausted mind struggling to comprehend the sudden change in direction. Smoky, no, he croaked, his voice barely a whisper against the gale. Come back here. But the dog completely ignored the command, reaching a large, uneven outcropping of jagged, snow-buried rock and immediately beginning to dig with a frantic, feverish intensity. Snow and heavy chunks of ice flew backward in wild arcs as Smoky's powerful front legs tore through the frozen earth. Jax let out a heavy, defeated sigh, detached his frozen shoulders from the pine tree, and forced himself to follow, climbing the slippery, treacherous incline on his hands and knees, his breath tearing through his lungs in ragged, painful gasps. When he finally dragged his exhausted body over the lip of the outcropping, he collapsed next to the dog, fully prepared to pull him away from whatever useless animal burrow he had found. But as Jax wiped the blinding snow from his frozen eyelashes, his gaze locked onto the dark recess Smoky had violently uncovered, and his heart skipped a heavy, startled beat. This was no animal den. Beneath the thick, heavy layers of untouched snow and tangled frozen mountain roots, Smoky had exposed a narrow vertical fissure in the rock face, but it was the edges of the rock that commanded Jax's absolute attention. They were not jagged, random, or created by the chaotic violence of tectonic shifts. The stone on either side of the narrow, terrifyingly dark opening had been deliberately, painstakingly cut. The lines were impossibly straight, bearing the unmistakable weathered marks of human masonry, ancient and worn smooth by the passage of countless decades, but undeniably constructed by a conscious hand. Jax stripped the heavy snow-caked glove from his right hand, his skin pale and trembling, and reached forward, pressing his bare palm against the frozen, chiseled stone. It was a terrifying anomaly, a ghost of human architecture buried in a place where humanity possessed no absolute right to exist. He leaned his face closer to the narrow, pitch-black opening, and a profound shiver ran down his spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the winter cold. A steady, faint draft of air was pushing outward from the darkness. It was not warm, but it was remarkably dry, and it carried the faint, ancient scent of old dust and deep, undisturbed earth. It is an entrance, Jax whispered. The absolute impossibility of the discovery momentarily overriding his crippling exhaustion. Smoky did not wait for an invitation. The fearless dog squeezed his broad shoulders into the narrow, claustrophobic opening, his dark body instantly swallowed by the absolute pitch-black void of the mountain. Wait. Jax reached forward, but his hand closed on empty air. The dog was gone, leaving Jax alone on the freezing ledge, with the howling storm at his back and a terrifying, unknown abyss in front of him. If staying outside meant a slow, freezing death in the snow, going inside meant facing a terror that was profoundly worse. The dark, narrow passage triggered an immediate, violent chemical reaction in Jax's brain. His breathing became erratic, rapid, and shallow. The towering pine trees behind him vanished, replaced in his mind's eye by the suffocating, reinforced concrete walls of the underground insurgent bunker in the Middle East. He could feel the fine, choking dust coating his throat. He could hear the terrifying, deafening groan of the massive ceiling supports buckling under the weight of the explosive ordnance. To squeeze himself into that dark, heavy rock was to willingly enter his own grave, to return to the nightmare that had fractured his mind and left him broken. He stood paralyzed on the ledge, the freezing wind threatening to push him over the edge, trapped entirely between the physical certainty of freezing to death and the psychological absolute terror of being buried alive. Then, from deep within the crushing darkness of the mountain, a soft, encouraging whine echoed off the ancient stone. Smoky. Jax closed his eyes, his fists clenching so tightly, his knuckles turned entirely white. "I cannot do this," he whispered to the storm. "I cannot go back in the dark." But the dog whined again, the sound bouncing off the walls, a tether of pure loyalty stretching out from the abyss to pull him in. Jax gritted his teeth, a low, guttural growl of pure, desperate defiance escaping his throat. He dropped to his knees, turned his shoulders sideways, and forced his large frame into the suffocating, freezing throat of the mountain. The darkness hit him with the physical force of a heavy woolen blanket, instantly stripping away his vision and plunging him into a terrifying sensory-deprived void. The rock walls pressed tightly against his chest and his back, scraping violently against his tactical jacket, forcing him to exhale completely just to slide forward another agonizing inch. The air grew immediately heavier, completely still, sealing out the roaring sound of the wind and replacing it with the deafening, terrifying sound of his own hyperventilating breath and the rapid hammering thud of his traumatized heart. He moved blindly, inch by agonizing inch, his hands desperately feeling the smooth-cut stone walls for any sign of space. The passage angled downward, forcing him to crawl, the ceiling dropping lower and lower until the solid stone was brushing against the top of his head. The panic began to rise in his chest, a dark, suffocating tide of pure adrenaline and primal terror. He was trapped. The mountain was going to crush him. The concrete was going to fall. Suddenly, the rock shifted beneath his heavy boot. A loud, sharp crack echoed violently in the confined space, followed by the terrifying rumbling sound of loose stone tumbling downward in the darkness ahead of him. Jax froze, his entire body locking into rigid, absolute paralysis. The sound of the falling rock was the exact horrifying sound of the bunker collapsing. His lungs seized completely, refusing to take in air. The darkness swirled behind his tightly shut eyes, flashing with explosive light, the phantom smell of cordite and blood filling his nostrils. He was suffocating. He was dying in the dark all over again. He squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a raw, broken sound of pure, unadulterated panic. His hands clawing desperately at the immovable stone walls, trying to push them back, trying to escape the crushing weight of his own mind. A heavy, solid warmth forcefully slammed into his chest in the pitch-black darkness. Smoky had pushed his way backward through the narrow passage, refusing to leave his master behind. The dog forcefully pressed his broad, muscular chest against Jax's face, licking his cold, trembling cheek, completely filling the suffocating void with his massive living presence. Jax grabbed the dog's thick fur with desperate, shaking hands, burying his face into Smoky's warm neck, pulling the air violently into his burning lungs. He grounded himself in the smell of wet fur, the powerful, rhythmic beating of the dog's heart, and the absolute reality of this specific, current moment. "I am here," Jax chanted repeatedly, a frantic whisper in the dark. "I am not there. I am here." Smoky remained perfectly still, a monumental anchor of calm in a sea of psychological chaos, waiting patiently until the violent tremors racking Jax's large frame slowly began to subside. When Jax finally opened his eyes, he realized the darkness was not entirely absolute. A faint, incredibly dim, grayish-blue light was softly filtering into the passage from somewhere further ahead. Smoky let out a soft huff and turned around, leading the way toward the faint, ghostly illumination. Jax followed, his movements trembling but determined, pushing past the terrifying confines of the narrow throat until the crushing walls suddenly and dramatically fell away. Jax stumbled forward, rising slowly from his knees, his jaw dropping in absolute stunned disbelief as his eyes adjusted to the space. They had not crawled into a random hollowed-out cave. They had crossed the threshold into a breathtaking, deliberate architectural marvel hidden completely from the world. It was a massive, subterranean chamber, the walls meticulously reinforced with ancient, expertly carved stone pillars that supported a high, sweeping vaulted ceiling. Faint, pale moonlight was filtering down through a clever, strategically carved vertical shaft high above, catching the dust motes dancing in the dead, silent air. In the center of the sprawling room sat a large, perfectly circular fire pit, constructed from blackened river stones, and along the far wall, incredible sprawling shelves had been carved directly into the living rock of the mountain. It was not a desperate hiding hole, it was a fortress, a permanent, masterfully engineered sanctuary designed to withstand the brutal passage of time and the most catastrophic forces of nature. Jax stood entirely motionless in the center of the silent, forgotten chamber, the crushing weight of his trauma, his freezing exhaustion, and his profound betrayal momentarily eclipsed by pure, absolute awe. Smoky walked calmly to the center of the room, circling twice near the ancient blackened fire pit, and lay down on the smooth stone floor, letting out a long, heavy sigh of profound relief. He was home. Jax slowly lowered his heavy duffel bag to the floor, the sound echoing softly off the sweeping stone walls. He looked up at the moonlight filtering through the hidden shaft, a single clear tear cutting a warm path through the frozen dirt on his scarred cheek. They had walked into the abyss expecting to die, and instead the mountain had opened its ancient stony heart and offered them a chance to live. The terrifying adrenaline-fueled urgency of their arrival slowly bled away, replaced by the crushing, absolute reality of profound physical exhaustion. Jax Harlan sat motionless on the smooth stone floor of the hidden chamber, his broad shoulders slumped forward, the echoes of his ragged breathing bouncing softly against the ancient vaulted ceiling. The faint, grayish-blue light filtering down from the vertical ventilation shaft high above offered just enough illumination to cast long, stretching shadows across the room, revealing the sheer, meticulous scale of the subterranean sanctuary. It was freezing inside the mountain, the air holding a deep, bone-chilling dampness that had settled into the rock over countless decades, but it lacked the violent, slicing bite of the wind outside. They were sheltered, but if they did not generate heat soon, the mountain would simply become a magnificent, quiet tomb. Jax forced his heavy, protesting body to move, pushing himself up from the floor with a groan that he did not bother to suppress. His combat instincts, honed through years of surviving in the most inhospitable environments on Earth, systematically took over, suppressing his emotional fatigue to focus entirely on the mechanics of staying alive. He began a slow, methodical sweep of the sprawling chamber. Moving toward the far wall, his hands traced the intricate, deliberate masonry, feeling the incredible smoothness of stones that had been shaped and fitted together without mortar, relying entirely on gravity and masterful engineering. Near the massive blackened fire pit in the center of the room, Jax discovered a rectangular alcove carved deeply into the floor, covered by a heavy slab of slate. When he pushed the heavy stone aside, his heart swelled with a profound sudden gratitude. Neatly stacked within the dry, protected recess were thick logs of ancient petrified wood, perfectly preserved by the absolute lack of moisture in the enclosed space. Whoever had built this fortress had meticulously prepared it for a long, unforgiving winter, leaving behind a lifeline for anyone desperate enough to find it. Jax knelt beside the circular fire pit, arranging the ancient timber with practiced, deliberate precision, creating a structured pyramid to allow for maximum airflow. He reached into his heavy tactical jacket, his stiff, freezing fingers fumbling as he retrieved a small, waterproof magnesium fire starter from his survival kit. He struck the metal rod with the back of his steel blade. The first shower of bright, brilliant sparks fell uselessly onto the cold stone. He gritted his teeth, his jaw tight with determination, and struck it again, harder this time. A cluster of sparks caught the edge of a dry, fibrous piece of kindling he had shaved from the logs. A tiny, fragile wisp of smoke curled upward into the dark air. Jax leaned forward, pressing his face close to the stone, and blew softly, coaxing the fragile ember to spread. Slowly, miraculously, A bright orange flame bloomed in the darkness. It licked hungrily at the ancient wood, growing steadily stronger, casting a warm, golden, flickering glow that aggressively pushed the heavy shadows back against the walls. The radiant heat hit Jax's frozen face like a physical blessing, melting the frost from his beard and drawing a long, shuddering sigh of pure relief from his lungs. The chamber completely transformed in the dancing firelight, revealing the astonishing beauty of the carved pillars and the sprawling, intricate network of shelves hewn directly from the living rock of the mountain. A low, strained sound pulled Jax's attention away from the hypnotic rhythm of the flames. Smoky had not moved from his position near the fire pit. The magnificent dog was lying on his side, his breathing slightly heavier than normal, his dark eyes watching Jax with a quiet, trusting intensity. Jax immediately noticed a dark, wet stain matting the thick fur on Smoky's left shoulder, shimmering dangerously in the firelight. The rock slide in the narrow tunnel had not missed him entirely. Jax moved instantly, dropping to his knees beside his only remaining comrade. "Hold still, brother," Jax murmured, his voice dropping into a soft, calming cadence that he only ever used with the dog. "Let me see what we are dealing with." Smoky did not flinch, nor did he pull away. He simply laid his heavy head flat against the warm stone, offering his injured body entirely to the man he had just saved. Jax carefully parted the thick, coarse fur, his heart clenching as he examined the wound. It was a jagged, shallow laceration across the dense muscle of the shoulder, likely caused by a sharp edge of falling shale. It was not deep enough to sever a vein or cripple the limb, but it was bleeding steadily, and in an environment this harsh, an infection was a guaranteed death sentence. Jax moved with rapid, practiced efficiency. He retrieved his small canvas medical kit from the duffel bag, pulling out a bottle of sterile saline, a roll of clean gauze, and a small tube of antiseptic ointment. He worked in absolute focused silence, flushing the cold rock dust from the open wound. Smoky let out a single soft whine as the stinging liquid hit his torn flesh, but the dog remained perfectly still, his tremendous discipline holding his natural instincts in check. "I know it burns," Jax whispered, his calloused hands moving with surprising gentle grace as he applied the thick ointment and firmly wrapped the shoulder in the white gauze. "But you have to stay strong. You are the only reason I'm breathing right now. I have got you. I will always have you." When he finished tying the bandage securely in place, Jax rested his hand heavily against the side of Smoky's neck, his thumb rhythmically stroking the soft fur beneath the dog's ear. Smoky let out a long, shuddering sigh, his eyes slowly closing as the radiant heat of the fire and the comforting touch of his master finally allowed him to rest. Jax stayed exactly where he was for a long time, watching the powerful rise and fall of the dog's chest, feeling the terrifying, chaotic adrenaline of the past 24 hours finally begin to drain out of his exhausted bloodstream. As the fire settled into a steady, crackling burn, Jax stood and began to explore the deeper recesses of the magnificent chamber. On the far wall, tucked securely into a narrow carved shelf that was elevated away from the floor, he found a bundle wrapped tightly in thick, waxed oilcloth. The material was stiff and completely hardened by age, cracking audibly as Jax carefully folded the corners back to reveal the contents. Resting inside the protective wrapping were 3 thick, leather-bound journals, their covers worn incredibly smooth by years of constant handling. The edges of the heavy parchment pages were yellowed and brittle, smelling powerfully of dried ink, old dust, and the passage of a century. Jax carried the heaviest of the volumes back to the fire, sitting cross-legged on the floor, and carefully opened the heavy cover. The handwriting on the first page was elegant, sweeping and intensely deliberate, written in a dark, faded sepia ink that spoke of a forgotten era. It was not the frantic scrawl of a desperate survivor, but the measured philosophical prose of an educated man who had made a conscious, permanent choice to vanish from the surface of the earth. The inscription read, "The Journals of Silas Thorne, Cartographer, Explorer, Exile. In the year of our Lord 1884. Jax slowly turned the delicate pages, his eyes tracking the graceful cursive in the flickering orange firelight. Silas Thorne had been a master mapmaker, a man contracted by massive wealthy rail companies and ruthless industrial barons to chart the untamed, dangerous wilderness of the western frontier. Silas had spent his entire life mapping the veins of the earth so that other men could rip them open for profit. But as the pages progressed, The tone of the journal shifted from scientific observation to a deep, profound despair. Silas wrote beautifully of the poison of human greed, of watching pristine, silent valleys completely destroyed by the deafening, unnatural roar of machinery and the endless, bloody cruelty of men killing each other over invisible boundary lines drawn on a piece of paper. The world above has become a factory of endless, deafening noise and unquenchable malice, Silas had written. The ink pressed so deeply into the page that Jax could feel the indentations of the pen. They build cities that block out the stars, and they declare themselves masters of a world they do not understand. I have mapped their empires, and I have found absolutely nothing of value within them. Therefore, I have chosen to map a different course. I have followed the ancient breath of the mountain downward, into the stone, where the ambition of evil men cannot reach. I have built a sanctuary not to hide from life, but to preserve my own soul from a society that demands its surrender. Jax stared at the heavy words, the firelight dancing across his scarred face. A profound, overwhelming sense of kinship washed over him, completely transcending the vast century of time that separated him from the ghost of Silas Thorne. Silas had not been a coward running from his husband, as a simpler story might have dictated. Silas had been a man at war with the crushing, toxic nature of the world, a man who realized that true peace could only be found by entirely removing himself from the machinery of human cruelty. It was the exact same heavy, suffocating realization that had haunted Jax since he returned from the battlefield. The world he had bled to protect had felt entirely alien, loud and brutally indifferent to his suffering. His own family had treated him as a broken liability. Sitting here, wrapped in the profound, heavy silence of the ancient mountain, reading the words of a kindred spirit, Jax felt a massive, invisible weight physically lift from his crushed chest. He was not crazy. He was not broken. He had simply been trying to survive in a world that was fundamentally incompatible with his spirit. Over the course of the next several weeks, a slow, beautiful rhythm settled over the underground fortress. The frantic, desperate edge of pure survival gradually smoothed out, evolving into a quiet, deeply fulfilling routine of deliberate existence. The chamber became more than just a shelter. It became a living, breathing home. Jax discovered a miraculous, continuous drip of pure, freezing, mineral-rich water at the deepest end of the cavern, pooling in a naturally eroded stone basin that Silas had deliberately expanded into a small reservoir. It tasted like life itself, crisp and completely untouched by human hands. He learned to manage the complex ventilation shaft, opening and closing the heavy stone damper Silas had engineered to perfectly control the temperature and draw the wood smoke cleanly out of the mountain without alerting the world above. When the brutal winter storms momentarily broke, painting the harsh wilderness in blinding, brilliant sunlight, Jax and Smoky would cautiously venture out into the dense timberline. They moved silently, like ghosts haunting the deep snow, gathering fallen, dead branches to replenish their vital wood supply, and occasionally hunting small game to sustain their strength. Smoky's shoulder healed with remarkable speed, the jagged cut closing into a tough pink scar, his magnificent strength returning in full force. The dog thrived in the wild, his senses razor-sharp, his loyalty absolute, acting as the perfect silent sentinel while Jax worked the land. The evenings were spent in the golden warmth of the central fire, the heavy silence of the mountain acting as a powerful, healing medicine. Jax would read from Silas Thorne's massive journals, absorbing the ancient cartographer's profound philosophies on solitude, endurance, and the silent, enduring majesty of the natural world. For the first time in over a decade, Jax Harlan stopped sleeping with one eye open, waiting for an ambush that never came. He stopped waking up drenched in cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs from the terrifying echoes of explosive artillery. The hollow, haunted look that had shadowed his eyes since his discharge slowly began to recede, replaced by a deep, grounded clarity. He was no longer a discarded soldier without a mission, nor was he the unwanted brother thrown out into the freezing dark. He was the warden of a forgotten sanctuary, standing alongside the most magnificent, loyal creature God had ever placed on the earth. Jax leaned heavily back against the smooth, carved stone pillar one evening, the fire burning low and steady, casting a soft, comforting warmth across his face. Smoky lay completely relaxed across his outstretched legs, the dog's massive head resting heavily on Jax's knee, his chest rising and falling in a slow, peaceful rhythm. Jax closed his eyes, listening to the absolute beautiful silence of the subterranean world, and for the first time since he was a young boy running through the summer fields, he felt completely, entirely at peace. But out in the freezing, unpredictable wilderness, peace is a fragile, temporary illusion. The mountain demands a toll for the sanctuary it provides, and as the deep winter continued to tighten its icy grip on the Bitterroot Valley, the isolation they had fought so desperately to claim was about to be violently shattered. The profound, healing tranquility that had settled over the hidden subterranean fortress was an incredibly beautiful, but ultimately fragile illusion. Jax Harlan had allowed himself to believe, if only for a few fleeting weeks, that he had successfully severed all ties with the cruelty of the modern world, burying his fractured past beneath the impenetrable weight of the Bitterroot Mountains. But the brutal, uncompromising reality of survival is that peace is never a permanent destination. It is merely a temporary ceasefire in an ongoing war for existence. The world above was a relentless, consuming machine, and it was only a matter of time before its sprawling, metallic tendrils reached into the deep, untouched silence of the wilderness. The shift did not announce itself with a dramatic, deafening explosion or a sudden, violent confrontation. It arrived with the subtle, terrifying quiet of a predator stepping softly onto a bed of dry pine needles. It was mid-morning, the sky above the towering, snow-laden canopy, a brilliant, piercing blue that offered absolutely no physical warmth. Jax and Smoky had ventured out further than their usual perimeter, navigating a dense, treacherous thicket of ancient blue spruce to harvest a cache of thick, dead branches that had been brought down by the heavy winter snows. The rhythmic, satisfying crack of dry wood snapping under Jax's heavy boots was the only sound breaking the immense crystalline silence of the frozen valley. Jax moved with a relaxed, fluid efficiency that he had not possessed in years. His muscles loose, his mind entirely focused on the simple, rewarding mathematics of gathering fuel to sustain their hidden fire. Suddenly Smoky stopped. It was not the curious, inquisitive pause of a dog catching the scent of a wandering snowshoe hare, nor was it the rigid, aggressive stance of a guardian preparing to fend off a hungry mountain lion. This was entirely different. Smoky's massive, powerful body instantly locked into a state of absolute statuesque paralysis. The thick, dark hackles along his spine rose sharply, forming a jagged ridge of warning. His ears pinned forward, capturing sounds that existed far beyond the limited range of human hearing, and his dark eyes stared unblinkingly into the dense, shadowed tree line to their immediate north. He did not issue a warning growl, not even the lowest vibration in his chest, because his supreme, ancient instincts understood that absolute, terrifying silence was the only acceptable response to this specific type of threat. The cold, heavy air in the forest instantly changed. The profound peace Jax had painstakingly built within his soul evaporated in a microscopic fraction of a second, entirely replaced by the cold, razor-sharp hypervigilance of a combat veteran who suddenly realizes he has walked blindly into an active kill zone. Jax did not call out to the dog. He did not drop the heavy bundle of gathered wood. He slowly, deliberately lowered the branches to the soft snow without making a single sound, his heart rate instantly doubling as the familiar icy rush of pure adrenaline flooded his veins. He lowered his center of gravity, his scarred hands instinctively falling to his sides, his eyes scanning the dense, confusing geometry of the snow-covered forest for any anomaly, any shadow that did not belong. He moved silently to Smoky's side, following the exact trajectory of the dog's unwavering gaze. At first, the blinding white glare of the sun reflecting off the snow completely obscured the details of the terrain, but as Jax narrowed his eyes, allowing his trained vision to piece together the visual puzzle, he saw it. Less than 50 yards away, cutting a deliberate, perfectly straight line across a pristine, untouched snowdrift, was a fresh set of bootprints. Jax felt a heavy, sinking weight drop into the bottom of his stomach. He signaled Smoky to stay with a sharp, silent gesture of his hand and moved forward with the excruciatingly slow heel-to-toe glide of a trained scout, ensuring he did not break a single twig beneath the snow. When he reached the edge of the tracks, he dropped slowly to one knee, the brutal cold seeping instantly through his heavy tactical pants, his eyes narrowing as he forensically dissected the physical evidence left behind. These were not the chaotic, staggering, uneven tracks of a lost, desperate hiker wandering aimlessly through the wilderness. These prints were evenly spaced, deliberate, and aggressively deep. The tread pattern was unmistakably tactical, designed for maximum grip and absolute silence on treacherous terrain. More terrifyingly, the stride indicated a man carrying a significant amount of weight, moving with the practiced, effortless efficiency of someone who hunted human beings for a living. Jax gently brushed his bare fingertips against the edge of the frozen indentation. The snow was still loose, the crisp edges of the prints slowly beginning to round off in the freezing wind. The tracks were less than an hour old. The pieces of a dark, insidious puzzle rapidly assembled in Jax's hyper-aware mind, connecting the rumors he had overheard in the dim, smoke-filled corners of the local feed store before Elias had cast him out. Massive, faceless corporate land developers, heavily backed by invisible foreign capital, had been aggressively buying up massive tracts of the Bitterroot Valley, preparing to clear-cut the ancient timber and build exclusive, high-end resorts. But the deep woods were notoriously infested with off-grid drifters, squatters, and stubborn hermits who refused to recognize their newly purchased property lines. To avoid lengthy, expensive legal battles and unwanted media attention, the corporate conglomerate had quietly hired private, ruthless contractors to forcefully sweep the mountains and erase the undocumented inhabitants. They had sent Marcus Vance. Jax knew the name. It was whispered with a mixture of profound respect and genuine terror by the seasoned hunting guides in the valley. Marcus Vance was not merely a tracker. He was a highly paid, utterly remorseless mercenary who viewed the wilderness not as a sanctuary, but as a tactical grid to be systematically conquered and cleared. If Marcus Vance was operating in this specific sector of the mountain, he was not looking for game. He was looking for anomalies. He was looking for smoke. He was looking for exactly what Jax and Smoky had built. A sudden chilling gust of wind swept through the tall pines, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible scent of gun oil and synthetic tactical fabric. Smoky let out a single, barely audible huff, his body vibrating with the immense effort it took to hold his ground. "We are leaving," Jax whispered, his voice incredibly tight, entirely devoid of emotion. He rose swiftly, his mind completely shifting away from the peaceful philosophy of Silas Thorne and fully embracing the cold, calculated arithmetic of warfare. They could not afford a confrontation out here in the open, not against a heavily armed, professional tracker who likely had superior optics and the high ground. Jax moved backward, deliberately placing his boots directly inside his previous footprints, a painstaking, exhausting process known as backtracking, designed to leave the illusion of a single, interrupted path. Smoky understood the assignment intuitively, following perfectly within his master's steps, his heavy tail tucked low to avoid brushing the surrounding snow. When they reached the edge of the dense, rocky incline that concealed the hidden, subterranean entrance, Jax grabbed a thick, heavy pine bough and spent an agonizing 20 minutes meticulously sweeping the powder over their trail, erasing their existence from the surface of the mountain. Only when the snow looked entirely undisturbed did he drop to his stomach and slide backward into the suffocating, pitch-black throat of the ancient stone fissure, calling Smoky in immediately behind him. The descent back into the grand chamber felt entirely different this time. It was no longer a miraculous, awe-inspiring return to a peaceful home. It was a desperate tactical retreat into a fortified bunker. As soon as they cleared the narrow passage and stood in the dim, grayish-blue light of the cavern, Jax moved with frantic, calculated speed. The warm, golden fire that had sustained their lives and provided profound emotional comfort was now a deadly, glowing beacon. Even with the masterfully engineered ventilation shaft dispersing the smoke, the faint smell of burning wood in the freezing mountain air would eventually draw Marcus Vance straight to their doorstep like a shark to blood. Jax grabbed a heavy, rusted metal bucket he had salvaged and quickly filled it from the freezing mineral pool at the back of the cave. He walked to the central fire pit, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached, and poured the freezing water directly over the glowing, perfectly seasoned coals. The fire hissed violently, sending a massive, blinding cloud of thick gray steam billowing upward toward the vaulted ceiling, before dying completely in a dark, sputtering choke. The immediate absence of light was jarring, but the sudden, aggressive plunge in temperature was terrifying. The heavy, damp cold of the ancient mountain instantly rushed back in from the walls, reclaiming the space, biting sharply through Jax's heavy clothing. Smoky let out a soft, confused whine in the sudden darkness, pacing nervously around the smoking, ruined remains of their heat source. "I know," Jax said, his voice echoing loudly in the pitch-black void, his tone heavy with regret and hardened resolve. "I know, brother, but we have to go dark. The war followed us." Jax moved blindly through the shadows, relying entirely on his spatial memory of the chamber. He located his heavy duffel bag and pulled out every piece of clothing he possessed, layering thick wool over tactical nylon before wrapping himself tightly in the stiff, heavy oilcloth that had protected Silas Thorne's journals. He sat heavily against the cold, carved stone pillar nearest the narrow entrance, positioning himself so he had a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the faint sliver of daylight bleeding into the tunnel. Smoky moved instantly to his side, curling his massive, warm body tightly against Jax's leg, pressing his back firmly against the man's chest to share their vital, declining body heat. Jax rested his hand on the dog's strong neck, feeling the rapid, steady beat of Smoky's heart, using the rhythm to deliberately slow his own breathing, forcing his mind to remain calm, analytical, and prepared for violence. As the hours dragged on, the cold seeped deeply into Jax's bones, stiffening his joints and threatening to drag him back into the terrifying hallucinatory realm of hypothermia. To keep his mind anchored, he closed his eyes and vividly recalled the sweeping, elegant handwriting of Silas Thorne from the leather-bound journals. Silas had experienced this exact, suffocating terror. Jax remembered a specific, chilling entry he had read by the firelight just days ago. "They do not stop," Silas had written in the winter of 1886. "The machinery of human greed cannot tolerate a blank space on a map, nor can it abide a man who refuses to participate in its endless destruction. I have heard the heavy boots of the railroad mercenaries echoing on the ridge above my sanctuary. They send their hounds into the wilderness, not to conquer the mountain, but to punish those who have found peace within it. To be left entirely alone is the greatest crime a man can commit against a society built on constant, deafening consumption." The striking, terrifying parallel between Silas Thorne's ancient exile and Jax's current reality cemented a profound, immovable resolve within the veteran's scarred heart. He was not just defending his own miserable life anymore, he was defending the sanctity of the mountain. He was defending the legacy of a master cartographer who had sought only silence, and he was defending the magnificent, loyal animal pressed against his chest who had saved him from the freezing abyss. Outside, beyond the thick, impenetrable walls of the stone fortress, the atmospheric pressure began to drop with a terrifying, aggressive suddenness. The faint sliver of blue daylight visible through the entrance tunnel rapidly darkened into an ominous, bruised purple gray. The wind, which had been a steady, whispering breeze all morning, began to rise, carrying a deep, low-frequency howl that vibrated through the ancient roots of the mountain. A massive, historically catastrophic winter cell was colliding with the Bitterroot Peaks. Jax tightened his grip on the heavy oilcloth, his eyes locked onto the dark tunnel. Marcus Vance was out there, calculating, hunting, entirely unfazed by the impending weather. The tracker was a human threat, cold and methodical. But the mountain was about to unleash a primal, indiscriminate fury that did not care about corporate contracts, property lines, or military training. The illusion of peace was completely shattered, replaced by a terrifying high-stakes collision of man, beast, and the unforgiving, violent forces of nature, all converging on the hidden stone sanctuary beneath the earth. The arrival of the storm did not build with the slow, predictable crescendo of a typical winter front. It struck the Bitterroot Range with the sudden, catastrophic violence of a detonated explosive, turning the sky from a bruised purple into an impenetrable, boiling black within a matter of minutes. The atmospheric pressure plummeted so rapidly that Jax Harlan could feel a sharp, physical ache behind his eyes and deep within the drums of his ears. Inside the pitch-black, freezing subterranean chamber, stripped of the comforting golden glow of their extinguished fire, the sensory deprivation was absolute. The massive, masterfully engineered stone fortress built by Silas Thorne was designed to withstand the crushing weight of the earth, but as the blizzard slammed against the sheer face of the mountain, the ancient rock itself began to vibrate with a terrifying low-frequency hum. The wind did not merely howl, it screamed with a primal, deafening frequency, tearing through the dense canopy of ancient pines above, snapping heavy trunks like fragile matchsticks, and hurling massive walls of compacted snow and ice against the hidden entrance of the cave. The brutal sub-zero temperature inside the chamber continued its aggressive, deadly descent, feeding on the absolute absence of heat. Jax sat huddled tightly against the carved stone pillar, swathed entirely in every piece of tactical clothing he owned and wrapped securely in the stiff, heavy oilcloth, but the cold was a living, breathing entity. It bypassed the thick layers of wool and synthetic fibers, sinking its icy teeth directly into his heavy bones, slowing the thick blood in his veins, and forcing his body into violent, uncontrollable shivers that exhausted his rapidly depleting energy reserves. Smoky was curled into a tight, massive ball directly across Jax's lap, acting as a biological furnace. The magnificent German shepherd buried his dark nose deep beneath his own thick, coarse tail to conserve his vital warmth, his heavy, muscular body rising and falling with slow, incredibly deep breaths. Jax maintained a desperate, bruising grip on the dog's thick coat, using the steady, rhythmic pulse of Smoky's heart as a metronome to keep his own terrified mind from spiraling completely into the dark. But as the blizzard reached its apex, a terrifying, unforeseen acoustical nightmare began to unfold within the cavern. The massive, incredibly powerful gusts of wind sweeping across the mountain peak were forced violently down into the intricately carved vertical ventilation shaft that Silas Thorne had engineered a century ago. The heavy, rushing air moving through the narrow, spiraling stone chimney compressed and distorted, completely altering its frequency. The sound that erupted into the dark chamber below was no longer the organic, chaotic howl of a winter storm. It was a rhythmic, concussive, mechanical thudding. Thud. 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 Jax froze. His violent shivering stopped instantly, replaced by a rigid, terrifying paralysis. The sound was exact. It was the precise, deafening, pulsating rhythm of the massive twin rotors of a CH-47 Chinook military transport helicopter hovering incredibly low over a combat zone. Jax's breath hitched violently in his throat. His dilated eyes stared blindly into the absolute pitch-black void of the freezing chamber, but he was no longer seeing the dark, ancient stone walls. The sensory trigger bypassed his logical brain entirely, tearing open the heavy, iron-vaulted doors of his deepest, most horrifying trauma. The Bitterroot Mountains vanished. The freezing cold evaporated, instantly replaced by the phantom, suffocating, 100-degree heat of the Middle Eastern desert. The deafening, rhythmic thudding intensified, and in Jax's fracturing mind, the sound shifted from helicopter rotors to the catastrophic, concussive impacts of heavy enemy artillery, slamming relentlessly into the scorched earth directly above him. He was back inside the subterranean forward operating bunker. The reinforced concrete walls were violently shaking under the relentless bombardment. He could smell the terrifying coppery stench of fresh blood mixing with the dry, choking odor of pulverized concrete and electrical fires. He could hear the desperate, screaming voices of his squadmates completely drowned out by the deafening roar of collapsing architecture. "Get down!" Jax screamed into the darkness of the mountain, his voice tearing raw and jagged from his throat. He threw his arms violently over his head, curling his large body into a tight, defensive fetal position on the freezing stone floor, desperate to protect himself from the massive ceiling supports that his traumatized mind fully believed were crashing down upon him. The phantom weight of thousands of pounds of crushing debris pressed down entirely onto his chest, completely paralyzing his lungs. He was buried alive. He was suffocating in the dark, choking on ash and dust, completely abandoned in a lightless tomb thousands of miles from home. His heart hammered against his ribs with the terrifying, erratic speed of a dying bird, his muscles locking in a state of absolute, pure, unadulterated terror. He could not breathe. He was drowning in dry air. Suddenly, a massive, solid, living weight slammed heavily onto his chest, completely pinning his thrashing shoulders against the hard stone floor. Smoky did not whimper, nor did he frantically lick his master's face in confusion. The highly intelligent, deeply empathetic animal instantly recognized the profound psychological collapse occurring within his handler. Using an advanced intuitive form of deep pressure therapy, Smoky threw his entire 70-pound, muscular frame directly across Jax's torso, forcing his broad, heavy chest squarely against the man's rapidly heaving sternum. The dog drove his warm, wet nose aggressively into the crook of Jax's neck, completely blocking out the cold air, and let out a deep, powerful, continuous vibration from deep within his own throat. It was a physical, undeniable anchor forcefully dropped into the violent, chaotic ocean of Jax's mind. "I am here." The weight of the dog communicated silently. "I am real. I am alive, and you are not there anymore." Jax gasped violently. A massive, tearing intake of freezing mountain air flooding his starved, burning lungs. He grabbed Smoky's thick fur with desperate, trembling, white-knuckled fists, holding onto the magnificent animal as if he were the very edge of a crumbling cliff. He buried his scarred face deeply into the dog's warm neck, the distinct organic smell of wet pines, snow, and dog completely overpowering the phantom stench of burning concrete and copper. "I am in the mountain," Jax chanted frantically, his voice breaking into a dry, ragged sob that he had held buried deep inside his chest for almost a decade. "I am in the mountain. I am with Smoky. I am alive." Smoky maintained the heavy, grounding pressure, completely unmoving, acting as an immovable, living shield against the ghosts of the past. He waited patiently, enduring the desperate, bruising grip of his master until the violent, terrifying tremors racking Jax's large frame slowly began to subside, and the chaotic, rapid-fire beating of the veteran's heart synchronized with the calm, steady rhythm of his own. When Jax finally opened his eyes, the terrifying hallucination had shattered, dissolving back into the freezing, pitch-black reality of the subterranean sanctuary. The wind was still howling viciously down the ventilation shaft, but it was just wind again, terrifying in its natural power, but completely devoid of malice. Jax released a long, incredibly shaky breath, slowly loosening his desperate, painful grip on Smoky's fur. He ran his trembling, calloused hands down the strong, muscular sides of the dog, an overwhelming, profound wave of gratitude, completely washing away the lingering edges of his panic. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice incredibly thick and incredibly weak. "Good boy, I have got you." He slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, pulling the heavy, stiff oilcloth tightly back around both of their freezing bodies. The psychological episode had completely drained what little energy he had managed to conserve, leaving him feeling hollowed out, incredibly fragile, and intensely aware of his own mortality. As the hours dragged on in absolute darkness, the storm outside showed absolutely no signs of relenting. It raged with a historic biblical fury, burying the landscape under feet of heavy, impenetrable snow. Jax sat in the quiet, freezing dark, his mind slowly clearing, turning inevitably toward the terrifying reality of the world directly outside their heavy stone walls. Marcus Vance was out there. Jax leaned his heavy head back against the cold, carved stone, a dark, complex thought crossing his mind. Marcus Vance was a highly trained, lethal professional, a man equipped with the best tactical gear money could buy, sent by powerful men to erase Jax from existence. But all of that expensive equipment, all of that ruthless training, meant absolutely nothing in the face of this specific, terrifying wrath. The mountain did not recognize corporate contracts. The mountain did not care about the size of a man's bank account or the lethal precision of his rifle. Jax vividly remembered another passage from the ancient, leather-bound journals of Silas Thorne. "The wilderness is the ultimate, uncompromising arbiter of truth," Silas had written. "It does not choose sides in the petty, violent squabbles of humanity. When the sky turns black and the deep freeze descends, the mountain merely cleanses the board. It treats the righteous man and the wicked man with the exact same beautiful, terrifying indifference." If Marcus Vance had not found secure, deep shelter before the whiteout hit, the tracker was already dead, frozen solid beneath a rapidly accumulating drift of white powder, his lethal ambitions completely extinguished by the indifferent breath of nature. Jax felt absolutely no joy in the dark thought, nor did he feel any pity. It was simply the brutal mathematical reality of the environment they were in. But as the storm screamed into its darkest, most violent hour, something entirely unexpected happened. Smoky, who had been resting his heavy head quietly on Jax's knee, suddenly snapped his ears forward, his entire body going completely rigid beneath the heavy oilcloth. He lifted his head, turning his dark muzzle directly toward the narrow, freezing passage that led out into the blinding white hell of the blizzard. Jax felt the immediate, profound shift in the dog's posture. He held his breath, straining his own ears against the deafening, continuous roar of the wind. At first he heard absolutely nothing but the violent, rushing air. But Smoky let out a sharp, anxious whine, pulling himself completely out from beneath the protective oilcloth and taking 2 deliberate steps toward the dark entrance. "What is it?" Jax whispered, his heart rate beginning to slowly climb again. Then, cutting through a brief, microscopic lull in the screaming gale, Jax heard it. It was incredibly faint, distorted, and broken by the heavy, swirling snow, but it was unmistakably, undeniably organic. It was not the howl of a hunting wolf, nor the screech of a dying pine tree. It was the desperate, weak, fading sound of a human voice crying out in the absolute dark. Jax froze entirely. A massive, agonizing war instantly erupting deep within his soul. His survival instincts, honed by years of warfare and reinforced by the profound, isolating philosophies of Silas Thorne, screamed at him to stay exactly where he was. The subterranean chamber was his fortress. It was safe. It was defensible. To step outside into a blinding, sub-zero blizzard with zero visibility was an act of pure, unadulterated suicide. The mountain was actively trying to kill everything on its surface, and the heavy stone walls were the only thing keeping him and Smoky alive. If it was Marcus Vance out there, the man who had come to kill him, going out meant risking his life to save his executioner. And if the tracker was not alone? The voice sounded small, desperate, and entirely wrong for a hardened mercenary. It sounded terrified. Jax looked at the dark, empty space where the warm fire used to be, and then he looked at the entrance. He thought of his older brother Elias, and the cold, unfeeling look in Sarah's eyes when they had thrown him out into the freezing night. They had chosen the warmth of their house over his life. They had chosen absolute self-preservation over the fundamental, unbreakable bonds of humanity. If Jax stayed hidden inside the dark, safe mountain while people froze to death just yards away in the snow, he would physically survive the night. But he realized with a crushing absolute certainty that he would completely and permanently destroy whatever fragile, healing piece of his soul he had managed to recover in this sanctuary. He would become exactly like the family that had abandoned him. Silas Thorne had hidden from the cruelty of the world, but Jax realized in that exact, terrifying moment that healing did not come from hiding. True healing only comes from finding the immense, impossible strength to step back into the violent storm to pull someone else out of the dark. Smoky did not wait for a command. The fearless, magnificent German shepherd walked directly to the mouth of the freezing tunnel, the bitter wind instantly, violently whipping his dark fur. The dog stopped at the threshold, turned his massive head, and looked back at Jax, his dark eyes shining with an absolute unwavering expectation. The choice was already made. Jax threw the heavy oilcloth violently aside. He grabbed the thick woolen scarf, wrapping it tightly around his lower face, pulled his heavy tactical gloves onto his trembling hands, and stood up, embracing the brutal, terrifying cold. "I'm coming with you, brother," Jax said, his voice entirely steady, entirely devoid of fear. "Lead the way." Leaving the suffocating, pitch-black safety of the subterranean passage and stepping out into the violently churning throat of the mountain was not merely crossing a physical threshold. It was willingly leaping into an active, swirling woodchipper of solid ice and deafening white noise. The brutal cold hit Jax Harlan with the blunt, staggering force of a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture on his eyelashes and violently stealing the warm breath directly from his lungs. The Bitterroot wilderness had completely vanished, replaced by an impenetrable, disorienting void of screaming white fury that erased the ground, the sky, and every ancient, towering pine tree that stood between them. Gravity itself felt distorted by the sheer, crushing velocity of the gale, threatening to violently rip Jax from his feet and hurl him blindly into the freezing abyss. Jax immediately dropped to his hands and knees in the deep, shifting powder, entirely unable to stand upright against the catastrophic force of the wind. He blindly reached out, his thick tactical glove desperately finding the coarse, snow-caked fur of Smoky's flank. "I cannot see," Jax screamed, his raw voice instantly swallowed and completely obliterated by the roaring storm before the sound could even travel an inch. "Lead me, brother, lead me." Smoky did not hesitate, nor did he display a single ounce of fear in the face of the mountain's terrifying wrath. The magnificent German shepherd lowered his massive aerodynamic head, transforming himself into a living, breathing icebreaker. He pushed forward into the blinding whiteout, his powerful, muscular shoulders violently parting the heavy, accumulating drifts, relying entirely on his ancient, infallible olfactory senses and a deep, primal intuition that far surpassed human comprehension. Jax crawled blindly behind him, maintaining a desperate, unbreakable physical grip on the thick leather harness strapped across the dog's chest. They were no longer man and beast. They were a single, synchronized organism fighting an impossible, agonizing war against the elements. Time completely dissolved into a chaotic, fragmented blur of burning lungs, agonizing muscle cramps, and the relentless slicing sting of horizontal ice crystals tearing at the exposed skin around Jax's eyes. They pushed through the blinding, freezing void for what felt like hours, though it could have merely been minutes, navigating a treacherous, completely invisible landscape of buried ravines and hidden, jagged rocks. Suddenly Smoky stopped. His powerful body went completely rigid beneath Jax's heavy hand, and the dog let out a sharp, frantic bark that vibrated forcefully against Jax's freezing glove. Jax forced his heavy head up, squinting through the agonizing, swirling whiteout. At first there was absolutely nothing but the churning, blinding storm, but as he crawled forward, bringing his face mere inches from the dog's dark muzzle, a subtle, unnatural anomaly materialized in the snowdrift directly ahead of them. It was a shape. A mound of snow that was slightly too perfectly rounded, slightly too large to be a buried stone. Jax violently shoved his freezing hands into the deep powder, sweeping the heavy, packed snow away with a frantic, desperate urgency. His thick glove struck something solid, yielding, and unmistakably organic. A heavy, insulated winter jacket. Jax dug faster, completely ignoring the agonizing, burning pain in his frozen knuckles, until he uncovered a human face. It was a man, his skin a terrifying, translucent shade of blue, his eyelashes completely fused shut by thick, heavy frost. Jax grabbed the man's heavy shoulders, roughly pulling him upward from the suffocating drift. But as the man's stiff, freezing body shifted, Jax's heart completely stopped in his chest. The man had not fallen randomly. He had deliberately curled his large body into a tight, protective arc over something smaller. As Jax pulled the man backward, the terrifyingly small, motionless form of a young child was revealed, completely entombed beneath the father's heavy coat. The child, a boy no older than 7, was clutched desperately to the man's chest, shielded from the worst of the slicing wind by the absolute final sacrifice of a parent's failing body. A profound, sickening wave of pure horror crashed over Jax, completely eclipsing the freezing temperature. This was not Marcus Vance. These were innocent civilians, caught entirely unaware by the sudden catastrophic violence of the mountain cell. Jax ripped his thick woolen scarf from his own face, instantly exposing his scarred skin to the slicing ice, and quickly checked the child's throat. A pulse. It was incredibly weak, thready, and fading with terrifying speed, but it was there. He reached for the father. Another pulse, barely a ghost of a rhythm beneath the freezing, rigid flesh. They were suspended on the absolute razor-thin precipice between life and death, and they possessed only minutes before their hearts simply surrendered to the cold. There was absolutely no time for complex tactical analysis. There was no time to calculate the staggering, impossible mathematics of dragging 2 unconscious, dead-weight human beings through a blinding sub-zero hurricane. Jax grabbed the heavy collar of the father's thick winter coat with his left hand and carefully scooped the freezing, rigid body of the young boy into the crook of his right arm, pressing the child tightly against his own chest to share whatever marginal, rapidly depleting body heat he had left. He looked blindly into the churning white void, entirely unable to see the entrance to the subterranean sanctuary, entirely unable to even guess which direction led back to salvation. Smoky Jax roared, his voice cracking violently with pure, desperate exertion. "Get us home." The dog let out a sharp, commanding bark and instantly surged forward, carving a deep physical trench through the heavy powder. Jax followed, initiating a brutal, agonizing physical crucifixion, dragging the heavy, unresponsive weight of the adult man while simultaneously carrying the child, forced Jax to fully engage every single muscle fiber in his back, legs, and shoulders. The deep, heavy snow actively fought against him, acting like a thick, freezing quicksand that violently sucked at his heavy boots with every agonizing step. The wind screamed in his ears, a deafening, demonic choir demanding that he simply drop the impossible burden, lie down in the soft, inviting snow, and finally rest. The physical pain transcended anything he had ever experienced in combat. His lungs burned with a terrifying, acidic fire, completely unable to process the thin, freezing oxygen fast enough to fuel his violently straining muscles. His vision began to narrow, the edges of the blinding whiteout turning a dark, pulsing black. The terrifying auditory hallucinations from the bunker attempted to claw their way back into his fracturing mind. He could faintly hear the concussive, rhythmic thudding of the helicopter rotors beneath the howling wind. He could feel the heavy, suffocating weight of the collapsing concrete pressing down onto his exhausted spine. But as the phantom darkness threatened to completely swallow his consciousness, Jax looked down at the tiny, freezing face of the child pressed against his chest. He saw the innocent, fragile life that was entirely, completely dependent on his strength. "I'm not a weapon anymore," Jax thought, the realization striking him with the profound, blinding clarity of a lightning bolt. "I am a shield." The incredible paradigm shift triggered a massive, dormant reservoir of pure, unadulterated adrenaline deep within his adrenal glands. He was no longer a discarded, broken soldier wandering aimlessly into the woods to die. He was Jax Harlan, the warden of the mountain, and he absolutely refused to let the storm claim these lives on his watch. He let out a deep, guttural, primal roar of absolute defiance, his heavy boots violently kicking through the snowdrifts, forcing his agonizing, failing body to march forward behind the relentless, dark shape of the German shepherd. Suddenly, the violent, slicing wind was abruptly cut in half. The blinding, churning whiteout darkened into a dense, heavy gray. Smoky had successfully navigated them directly into the narrow, jagged throat of the stone fissure. Jax collapsed to his knees, the absolute second they crossed the threshold, dragging the heavy, freezing bodies entirely out of the storm and onto the smooth, cold stone floor of the passage. The immediate, deafening absence of the wind was shocking, replaced by the terrifying, desperate sound of his own ragged, hyperventilating breath echoing violently off the ancient walls. He did not pause to rest. He could not. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, dragging the father and carrying the child deep into the main cavern, laying them carefully on the floor where the golden fire had burned just hours ago. He stripped his own heavy, insulated tactical jacket off, wrapping it tightly around the freezing child, and draped the thick, stiff oilcloth entirely over the unconscious father, attempting to trap whatever fragile, microscopic trace of warmth they possessed. Jax fell back against the smooth, carved stone pillar, his chest heaving violently, his entire body trembling with profound, terrifying exhaustion. His muscles twitched involuntarily, pushed entirely past the absolute limits of human endurance. They had survived. He had done the impossible. He closed his eyes, entirely prepared to surrender to the overwhelming narcotic pull of unconsciousness. But Smoky did not lie down. The dog did not seek the lingering warmth of the oilcloth, nor did he collapse onto the floor to recover from his own tremendous physical exertion. Instead, Smoky stood absolutely rigid at the edge of the dark, narrow passage leading back out into the blizzard. He turned his heavy, majestic head, his dark eyes locking onto Jax with a piercing, undeniable intensity, and let out a sharp, urgent, demanding bark. Jax opened his bloodshot eyes, staring at the dog in absolute horrified disbelief. "No," Jax whispered, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of strength. "Smoky, no, there is nothing left in the tank. I cannot go back out there. If I go back out there, I will die." Smoky did not break eye contact. The dog took one deliberate heavy step back toward the freezing tunnel, pausing to look over his shoulder, his message completely, terrifyingly clear. The job is not finished. There is one more. A profound, sickening dread pooled heavily in Jax's stomach. The father and the child were innocent victims of the mountain, but if there was another body buried out in that freezing, blinding hellscape, it was not a lost hiker. It was Marcus Vance, the man who had been paid a small fortune to track him down and put a high-caliber bullet through his skull. Jax stared into the dark void of the tunnel, the complex, agonizing moral arithmetic paralyzing his exhausted mind. Why should he risk his own life, a life he had just barely managed to claw back from the absolute brink of destruction, to save a ruthless, cold-blooded mercenary who actively wanted him dead? The mountain had already executed a perfect, flawless justice. All Jax had to do was sit in the quiet darkness of the sanctuary, close his eyes, and let the blizzard finish the brutal work it had started. He would be entirely safe. The threat would be completely, permanently erased, buried beneath 10 feet of impenetrable ice, and no one in the world would ever know the difference. But as the dark, tempting thought echoed through the freezing cavern, Jax realized the profound, terrifying truth. If he allowed a man to freeze to death simply because it was convenient, simply because he deemed the man unworthy of salvation, he was no different than Elias and Sarah. He was no different than the callous, indifferent society that Silas Thorne had fled from. To leave Marcus Vance to die in the snow was to completely surrender his own humanity, to allow the trauma and the cruelty of the world to finally, completely conquer his soul. Jax slowly, agonizingly pushed himself up from the cold stone floor, his muscles screaming in violent, searing protest, his joints popping loudly in the silent chamber. He did not have his heavy tactical jacket anymore. He had wrapped it around the child. He wore only a thick wool sweater, entirely insufficient for the apocalyptic conditions raging outside. He walked heavily toward the entrance, his scarred hands trembling violently, and looked down at the magnificent, fearless animal waiting for him in the dark. "You are a difficult commanding officer," Jax whispered, a weak, broken smile briefly touching the corners of his frozen lips. "Let's go get him." They plunged backward into the violent, screaming abyss. The storm had somehow intensified, the temperature dropping so low that the moisture in Jax's eyes threatened to freeze solid with every blink. The cold tore through his wool sweater instantly, biting deeply into his bare skin like 1,000 invisible, jagged razor blades. Smoky led the way, navigating a completely different trajectory this time, moving aggressively toward a steep, treacherous embankment entirely hidden beneath a massive, overhanging snowdrift. The visibility was absolutely zero. Jax moved entirely by faith, keeping one freezing hand securely anchored to the dog's thick harness, blindly stumbling through the heavy, suffocating powder. They found him at the base of the sheer incline, Marcus Vance. The tracker was not completely unconscious, but he was rapidly losing the final, agonizing battle against the hypothermia. His expensive, high-tech tactical gear was completely encased in thick, solid armor of white ice. His high-powered rifle lay uselessly buried in the snow several feet away, completely abandoned by frozen hands that could no longer operate the complex machinery of death. Marcus was slumped heavily against the frozen rock face, his head tilted back, his eyes half open and completely unfocused, staring blindly into the churning white chaos of the storm. Jax dropped heavily to his knees beside the dying mercenary, the violent wind screaming in his ears. He grabbed the heavy collar of Marcus's tactical vest, roughly shaking the man's frozen shoulders. "Hey!" Jax roared over the gale. "Hey, look at me!" Marcus slowly, agonizingly rolled his heavy head to the side, his glazed, dying eyes locked onto Jax's face, a flicker of profound, disoriented confusion crossing his frozen, pale features. His lips moved entirely sluggishly, forming words that were instantly ripped away by the howling wind. But Jax could read the unmistakable shape of his mouth. "You? Yeah, it's me," Jax screamed, grabbing the heavy nylon drag handle securely stitched into the back of Marcus's tactical vest. "And today is not the day you die in the dirt." Jax planted his heavy boots deep into the shifting powder, tightened his agonizing grip on the tactical handle, and threw his entire body weight backward. The heavy, dead weight of the mercenary shifted, tearing free from the frozen rock face with a sickening crunch of breaking ice. The final return trip to the hidden sanctuary was not a rescue mission, it was a slow, brutal, agonizing death march. Jax possessed absolutely no physical strength left to draw from. His body was running entirely on the microscopic fumes of pure willpower and the profound, terrifying realization that if he stopped moving for even a single second, neither of them would ever stand up again. He dragged Marcus backward through the heavy, suffocating drifts, pulling the massive weight foot by agonizing foot. His boots slipped constantly on the treacherous hidden ice beneath the powder, sending him crashing violently to his knees again and again. Every time he fell, the dark, narcotic whisper of the cold begged him to simply stay down, promising him absolute, painless peace. And every single time he fell, Smoky was there. The magnificent dog would aggressively grab the heavy fabric of Jax's wool sweater in his powerful jaws, violently pulling backward, growling and barking, completely refusing to let his master surrender to the dark. Smoky was not just guiding them, he was physically, violently anchoring Jax to the world of the living. 10 yards, 5 yards, the narrow, jagged black throat of the stone fissure finally materialized through the blinding, swirling gray. Jax let out a final, tearing scream of pure exertion, throwing his entire body backward, dragging the heavy mercenary violently over the threshold and into the pitch-black passage. They collapsed in a chaotic, tangled heap on the freezing stone floor, entirely out of the reach of the screaming wind. Jax could not stand up, he could not even push himself onto his hands and knees. He grabbed the collar of Marcus's tactical vest and simply rolled, dragging the unconscious man deeper into the main cavern with the final, dying spasms of his exhausted muscles. When they finally reached the center of the dark chamber, Jax released his desperate clawing grip on the nylon handle. His arms fell heavily to the smooth stone floor, completely devoid of strength, entirely devoid of feeling. The heavy, profound silence of the ancient subterranean fortress instantly swallowed the chaotic, ragged, hyperventilating sound of his breath. Smoky walked slowly over to his master, his massive head drooping with profound exhaustion, and collapsed heavily onto the floor, pressing his warm, thick body tightly against Jax's violently trembling side. Jax lay flat on his back on the freezing stone, staring blindly up into the absolute pitch-black void of the vaulted ceiling. He was surrounded by the freezing, unconscious bodies of the innocents he had protected, and the enemy he had chosen to save. The terrifying, agonizing ghosts of the underground bunker that had haunted his every waking moment for years were completely, entirely silent. He had walked directly into the blinding, freezing abyss, and he had not been crushed by the dark. He had conquered it. Jax closed his heavy, frost-covered eyes, completely surrendering to the overwhelming, crushing exhaustion, pulling the steady, rhythmic warmth of the magnificent German shepherd tightly against his chest as the silent ancient mountain stood guard over them all. The storm did not surrender its violent siege all at once. It broke slowly, the deafening, catastrophic roar of the howling wind gradually fracturing into uneven, exhausted gusts, before finally settling into a profound, heavy silence that felt almost unnatural in its purity. Inside the pitch-black, freezing expanse of the subterranean sanctuary, the absolute absence of the storm's acoustic assault was the first indication that the world had survived the night. Slowly, miraculously, a brilliant, piercing shaft of pure, untouched morning sunlight descended perfectly through the ancient carved ventilation shaft high above, cutting through the dense, freezing dark of the cavern like a divine golden blade. Jax Harlan lay completely motionless on the smooth stone floor, his heavy, scarred body locked in a state of profound, terrifying stiffness. The crushing sub-zero cold had settled deep into the marrow of his bones, but as the first fragile rays of sunlight touched the bruised, frost-bitten skin of his cheek, he realized with a staggering, overwhelming wave of clarity that his lungs were still pulling in air. He was alive. He slowly opened his heavy, bloodshot eyes. The golden light illuminated the sprawling, masterful architecture of Silas Thorne's ancient fortress. But Jax did not look at the magnificent stone pillars or the sprawling carved shelves. His immediate, desperate focus snapped directly to the bodies lying on the floor around him. He forced his violently protesting, agonizingly stiff muscles to fire, pushing himself up onto his hands and knees with a sharp, involuntary groan. He crawled agonizingly toward the father and the young child. His heavy tactical jacket, which he had sacrificed to wrap around the small boy, was completely rigid with frost. Jax reached out with a trembling, pale hand, pressing his numb, calloused fingers against the child's incredibly pale neck. A pulse. It was slow, and the child's lips possessed a terrifying, faint blue tint, but the rhythm was steady. Beneath the heavy, stiff oilcloth, the father's chest rose and fell in a shallow, rhythmic cadence. They had walked right up to the absolute razor-thin edge of the abyss, but they had not fallen in. A profound, shuddering sigh of pure, unadulterated relief escaped Jax's cracked lips. He turned his heavy head, his gaze shifting across the cold stone floor to the final dark shape lying near the massive, blackened fire pit. Marcus Vance. The ruthless, highly trained mercenary was no longer encased in the thick, suffocating armor of solid ice. The ambient, slightly regulated temperature of the deep cavern had slowly melted the frozen crust from his expensive tactical gear, leaving him soaking wet and violently shivering. As Jax watched, Marcus let out a sharp, ragged gasp, his entire body jerking as his consciousness violently slammed back into his physical form. The tracker's eyes snapped open, wide and completely disoriented, filled with the chaotic, primal terror of a man who fully believed he had just died. Marcus stared blindly up at the sweeping, vaulted stone ceiling, his mind scrambling to process an environment that made absolutely no logical sense. His frantic gaze darted wildly around the shadows, searching for his weapon, searching for an exit, until his eyes finally locked onto Jax. Jax did not move. He remained kneeling on the cold stone, his massive shoulders slumped with exhaustion, his scarred face illuminated by the single shaft of golden sunlight. Beside him, Smoky sat at perfect rigid attention, the magnificent German shepherd acting as an unshakable silent guardian, his dark, intelligent eyes fixed entirely on the mercenary. For a long, tense, silent minute, neither man spoke. The profound, heavy gravity of the situation slowly settled over Marcus's features, replacing his initial primal panic with a deep, unsettling realization. He looked at his empty hands, at his soaked, useless tactical vest, and then back to the man he had been hired to systematically hunt down and execute. "You," Marcus croaked, his voice a raw, broken whisper, completely stripped of its usual cold authority. "You brought me inside." Jax held the mercenary's gaze, his own eyes entirely devoid of anger, entirely devoid of the violent, reactive hatred that a war zone usually demanded. "Yeah," Jax replied, his voice quiet, carrying the immense, immovable weight of the mountain itself. Marcus swallowed hard, a visible tremor racking his broad shoulders that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing temperature. "Why?" he asked, the single word hanging heavily in the cold air, carrying the desperate confusion of a man whose entire ruthless worldview had just been violently shattered. "I was tracking you. I was sent to clear this grid. If you had left me in that drift for 5 more minutes, your problem would have been permanently solved." Jax looked away from the tracker, his gaze drifting toward the heavy, leather-bound journals of Silas Thorne, resting safely on the carved shelf. He thought about the crushing, toxic machinery of the world that Silas had fled, the absolute, terrifying cruelty of his own brother Elias, and the profound healing mercy he had found in the unwavering loyalty of a dog. "Because if I let the mountain bury you when I had the power to stop it," Jax said softly, turning his gaze back to Marcus, "then I am no better than the men who signed your paycheck. I refuse to let the cruelty of this world turn me into a monster just to survive it. You don't get to die in the snow, Marcus. You get to live, and you get to carry the heavy weight of knowing that the man you were sent to kill is the only reason you're still breathing." Marcus stared at him, the hardened, impenetrable mask of the professional mercenary completely crumbling, revealing the broken, terrified human being beneath. He slowly lowered his head, resting his face in his trembling hands, completely overwhelmed by a profound, inescapable shame that no amount of money could ever wash away. "I'm done," Marcus whispered to the stone floor. "I'm entirely done with all of it." The heavy, emotional silence of the cavern was suddenly, violently interrupted by a sound echoing from outside the mountain. It was a deep, rhythmic, mechanical thudding. Jax froze instantly. The sound grew louder, vibrating powerfully through the ancient stone, a massive concussive frequency beating against the heavy frozen air. Rotors. But this time, the terrifying, suffocating walls of the subterranean bunker did not violently close in on his mind. The phantom smell of burning concrete and copper did not flood his senses. Jax's lungs expanded fully, drawing in a deep, clean breath of the freezing, pure mountain air. He looked down at Smoky. The dog was not pressing his heavy weight against Jax's chest in a desperate attempt to ground him. Smoky simply stood up, his tail giving a single calm wag, and looked toward the narrow, dark tunnel leading outside. It was not a hallucination. It was not the ghosts of the past returning to drag him back into the dark. It was the heavy, thumping rhythm of a massive search and rescue helicopter, circling the snow-covered peak. Jax stood up slowly, every single muscle in his body screaming in protest, and walked deliberately toward the entrance. When he squeezed through the narrow, jagged fissure and stepped out onto the blinding, sunlit ledge, the sheer, staggering beauty of the Bitterroot wilderness took his breath away. The catastrophic storm had completely erased the world, painting the towering peaks and deep valleys in a pristine, flawless, brilliant white. Hovering less than 200 yards away, the massive red and white fuselage of a rescue chopper cut through the freezing air. Jax raised his arm, waving heavily. The pilot spotted him instantly, banking the massive aircraft sharply and initiating a careful, precise descent toward a flat, snow-covered clearing just below the ridge. The next 2 hours were a chaotic, blurred whirlwind of blinding snow, deafening engine noise, and the frantic, highly organized movement of emergency personnel. The rescue teams, heavily bundled in bright orange parkas, scrambled up the treacherous incline, their eyes widening in absolute stunned disbelief when Jax led them into the hidden, magnificent architecture of the subterranean fortress. They carefully loaded the unconscious father and the fragile, shivering child onto heavy, rigid stretchers, wrapping them in thick thermal blankets and rushing them toward the waiting aircraft. Marcus Vance walked out of the cavern on his own 2 feet, though he leaned heavily against one of the medics. Before he stepped into the chaotic downwash of the helicopter rotors, the mercenary stopped and turned back. He looked at Jax, who stood completely still at the edge of the tree line with Smoky sitting proudly at his side. Marcus did not say a word, but he slowly, deliberately raised his hand to his brow in a crisp, respectful salute, a profound, silent acknowledgement from one warrior to another, a surrender of his mission, and a vow of absolute silence regarding the location of the sanctuary. Jax simply nodded once in return. By the time the sun began to dip below the jagged western peaks a week later, the unbelievable story of the discarded veteran and his magnificent dog who had miraculously pulled 3 people from an apocalyptic blizzard had swept across the valley, entirely dominating the local news. The corporate developers, terrified of the massive public relations disaster of being associated with the near death of a family, quietly and entirely abandoned their aggressive efforts to claim that specific sector of the Bitterroot Range. Jax had agreed to meet the local sheriff at the base of the mountain to provide a final statement, completely refusing to travel into the crowded, noisy town. As he stood near the edge of the plowed highway, the freezing wind rustling the thick, dark fur of the dog sitting patiently at his side, a sleek, expensive SUV pulled sharply onto the shoulder of the road. The heavy doors opened, and Elias and Sarah stepped out into the biting cold. They looked entirely out of place against the rugged, wild backdrop of the mountain. Elias wore a heavy, expensive designer coat, his face completely pale, his eyes darting nervously as he approached. Sarah trailed slightly behind him, her usual cold arrogance entirely replaced by an incredibly awkward, desperate hesitation. Jax watched them approach with absolute, total emotional detachment. The terrifying, crushing weight of their betrayal, the intense, burning anger that had almost destroyed him on the night they threw him out, was completely, entirely gone. Looking at them now, he did not see the powerful family that had cast him into the abyss. He only saw 2 incredibly small, profoundly frightened people who were entirely trapped by their own selfishness. Jax, Elias started, his voice completely lacking its usual authoritative bite. "We saw the news. The entire state is calling you a hero. The mayor wants to give you a commendation." Jax did not reply. He simply stared at his brother, his silence acting as a heavy, impenetrable wall. Elias swallowed hard, shifting his weight uncomfortably in the snow. "Look, things got out of hand the night you left. We were stressed about the estate. We didn't mean for you to wander into a deadly blizzard. You can come back to the farmhouse. We can set up the spare room for you. Properly this time." Sarah nodded quickly, offering a tight, completely synthetic smile. "We are family, Jax. You belong with us." Jax looked at the woman who had coldly stated she was not running a charity, and then at the brother who had handed him a death sentence with a stack of legal papers. He reached down, resting his scarred, calloused hand gently on the top of Smoky's magnificent broadhead. The dog leaned into the touch, a profound, undeniable living testament to what true, unbreakable loyalty actually looked like. "You did not cast me out, Elias," Jax said, his voice incredibly calm, completely devoid of anger, ringing with the absolute, profound clarity of the mountain air. "You set me free." Elias blinked, completely stunned by the profound lack of hostility. "What are you talking about? I spent my entire life trying to bleed enough to prove I belonged at that table," Jax continued, his gaze drifting past his brother, looking up toward the towering, snow-capped peaks that held his true home. "But blood does not make a family. Action makes a family. Sacrifice makes a family. I walked into the dark expecting to die, but the mountain gave me exactly what you refused to. It gave me a sanctuary. And this dog," Jax paused, his voice thickening with immense, unbreakable emotion, "gave me a reason to survive it." Jax took a deliberate step backward, completely severing the invisible, toxic chain that had bound him to them for his entire life. "Keep the house, Elias. Keep the land. I have absolutely everything I will ever need. Do not ever come looking for me again." Without waiting for a response, Jax Harlan turned his back on his past and began the long, steady ascent back up the treacherous, winding trail into the deep, Bitterroot wilderness. He was no longer a broken, discarded ghost haunting the edges of society. He was the warden of the deep timber. He was the guardian of the hidden sanctuary built by Silas Thorne, a man who had finally found absolute, enduring peace by completely surrendering to the wild. And as they disappeared into the dense, ancient shadows of the towering pines, Smoky trotted faithfully at his side, the magnificent German shepherd and the scarred veteran walking together into a quiet, beautiful existence that absolutely no one in the world could ever take away from them. If this incredible journey of survival, sacrifice, and redemption moved you, and if you truly believe in the unmatched, unbreakable loyalty of dogs and the powerful reality of second chances, please take a moment to engage with this story. Drop the word Warden in the comments below so I know you stayed with Jax and Smoky until the very end. If you want to hear more deeply emotional, cinematic stories honoring the silent battles of our veterans and the heroic animals that stand by their side, smash that subscribe button and join our community. Your support ensures these stories are never forgotten. Stay strong and always protect your pack.